Hi, good evening. I'm Dr. Philip McMillan. Thank you for joining me. And today I'm just going to review the top 10 Vejon videos for 2023. Really appreciate all the people who have been involved, making comments. And that's part of what I'll be doing as well, looking at some of the top comments over the past year. Just as an introduction, I'm a physician, medical doctor. I have almost 30 years of clinical experience. I am a clinical researcher, which means that I look at research and try and integrate it into a clinical context. And as such, by doing this research at the beginning of the pandemic, our team of researchers recognized that this is likely to be a viral mediated autoimmune disease, severe COVID 19. And that critical bit of understanding has shared or directed my focus into looking for autoimmune complications. The sad reality is that most of what I think or thought was going to occur has occurred. What's very worrying is what is likely to occur in the future is still not going to be pretty. But on a lighter note, why don't we take a look at some of the top videos for 2023? I'll be going in sequence from 10 down to 1. So this is a true countdown, and I'll share with you again the top comments from those videos, for which I really do learn and reflect on, as I tend to try and, as best as possible when I have time, engage with the comments. So let's start at number 10. This is a more recent video, the slow kill of COVID reinfection. So this is only a few weeks old, and the image was designed to draw the attention of the viewer to the fact that COVID 19, this ongoing epidemic in highly vaccinated regions with reinfections, is not to be underestimated. And the highlight of that video was really saying that the evidence suggests that every time there is a reinfection, there is likely to be a problem. And in the context of autoimmunity, what we would then have is a situation where each time there's a reinfection, there is more autoimmune responses, and that can then lead to even worse disease in the population. The top comments from that video, and that video had 131,000 views that I have there, is that this stands up as not one unvaxxed person regrets their decision. Now, as usual, I always put balance in my perspective. I understand what he's meaning, but you do have to remember that there were some people before the vaccine who died of severe COVID 19. I'm not sure if necessarily that would have been their perspective, but I do appreciate what he means in the context of those people who had natural immunity, who were unvaccinated, had passed through the phase of the pandemic. They certainly don't seem to regret their decisions. This is another top comment. So that one had 1,100 likes. And this is the other point that I realized, that this resonates with a lot of people. Here, this person was talking about people getting sick in Belgium, and he was talking about the vaccinated people around him being much sicker than the non vaccinated people. He didn't get it, neither did his wife or kids. Best decision we ever took. And again, it's highlighting an important point about the fact that if he made it through that part of the pandemic, they oftentimes feel that they therefore are in a much better position. The evidence from natural immunity seems to support that. Granted, that's not necessarily being what's told to the general public. The final comment here is that, and yet, despite all the problems that the SAT is having with this, well, I'll not make a comment, but I'll observe it. Nobody is screaming about the origins. I think that's really important, and bringing to justice those involved. This is such an important comment. And as I said, you learn from the comments, and that had 871 likes, and that resonates with people because it is true. There should be very clear research into the origins of origins of where the virus came from. Many people still argue that it was just a natural selection, but the evidence suggests that a lot of work was done on a similar virus, and that needs to be addressed. It's disappointing that the WHO didn't get to the bottom of that. And it's disappointing that the involvement of different scientists, certainly in the USA, was not brought to the fore. So these are very serious points that I think really do need to be addressed. So moving on to video number 9. And this video here is the potential danger of spike protein tolerance. So this was when the first paper came out talking about IgG4. I didn't immediately post on it. I took some time to kindly really reflect on what IgG4 meant. And I was looking at how the body uses IgG4 with regards to like bee stings with beekeepers. And I realized that this was a really critical point. It was a 4,000% rise in the context of IgG4 antibodies. This was not to be ignored. Now, many of the scientific community said, no, this is not a problem. I don't know how they would know that because we've not seen that pattern before. And so what it suggested was that specifically the mRNA vaccines were driving the immune system to become more tolerant to spike protein, theoretically, therefore, from infection and vaccination. And it could be one of the reasons why we saw more circulating infection in highly vaccinated regions. Really critical point, and one that has to be addressed still properly by the scientific community. Here were some comments, and that video had about 160,000 views. So this was number 9. But the top comments there that I had been selected, which really seemed to resonate with people, 1.1 thousand likes. This person was sick with mast cell disease since birth, and they weren't sure whether it was caused by vaccines in infancy. That's possible. The immunologist tried to get her to take a jab. She declined, reminding about the allergic response. He told me he'd stand in case I had anaphylaxis. So he was willing to risk my life for this shot and as well as long-term damage for an already damaged immune system. Glad I stood my ground. Yeah, I think she probably was right there. And I don't understand why people don't seem to get this really simple point, is that in terms of severe COVID-19, if we had spent more time, as the scientific community had spent more time focusing on understanding who gets severe disease, it would be pretty clear that not everybody, and actually one of the things that should have stood out is people who were immune suppressed early in the pandemic, slightly different now, but people who were on immunosuppressants were not as likely to have severe disease. So if she was on immunosuppression at the time, it's quite possible that she was at lower risk. So she made a good point and a good decision, because it seems that, especially with the immune changes that occur in vaccination, one has to be very careful in the context of autoimmune diseases. So continuing along, here, I personally know 6 people, one of them my younger sister, who after taking the booster were suddenly diagnosed with stage 4 blood cancers. The sister was diagnosed with lymphoma out of nowhere, leukemia, and the others all had the same pattern. I did some research, and there is a correlation. Now, I think that you can't ignore that from a clinical perspective, but we have to be careful not to necessarily associate every single disease with the pandemic and some of the pandemic outcomes. That's one of the things that we have to be cautious about. Um, Potentially, in that family situation, there may have already been a genetic risk for cancer. And it is possible that the use of immune changing medication, you could say, could then cause worsening or an increased susceptibility. We don't fully understand it, but again, I wouldn't discount it, but I wouldn't say that this is necessarily the outcome for everyone. There must have been a reason in that family why we saw that degree of propensity, but that did still resonate with people, which suggests that possibly other people have seen the same thing. 355 likes. And then finally, here, I think many doctors have abandoned the oath they once took: do no harm. One of the things that has been coming out consistently, and I worry about this, is the perception in the general public that a lot of the decisions were driven by the doctors. Now, all I can say is that if you think carefully as to where vaccines were administered, it was not in the majority of cases in practices. It wasn't in hospitals. It was delivered from a public health standpoint. And the majority of clinicians were actually taking the vaccines in the context of almost being patients themselves. And so it's the public perception that doctors are at fault. And to some degree, they may be right, because if we had been doing more research and more challenges to what was happening, it's quite likely that it would have made an impact with how the public perceived long-term safety, because we couldn't have known. So there is some truth there, but I think that it's important to add that balance and to let people know that truthfully, for the majority of them, they were not directly involved in that decision. Granted, they didn't disagree with it, which is a different context. But that was the top comments for that number 9 video. So moving on to number 8. So the number 8 video is countries with high vaccine hesitancy. What were the outcomes? This was one of my favorite videos, actually. And it came out of information that was at a conference. So they had a conference, a mining conference, where one of the presenters asked this really simple question. He says, I just can't understand how where we are in Papua New Guinea, which has one of the lowest vaccination rates in the world, how is it that they don't have COVID spreading through and causing all kinds of problems? It's not a wealthy country. It has poor health infrastructure. How is it that they survived? And so when I heard that, I went and looked at the data, whatever data that was available, and it was pretty clear that for this country with over, I think, 9 million, almost 9 million population, they only had about 670 deaths around the COVID pandemic. And so it was a fascinating concept, but the scientific community clearly didn't seem to have much interest in it because it didn't fit with the narrative. That video had 172,000 views. It's in a number 8 position. And what we have here are the top comments. And this comment was: the vaccine was not brought in for COVID. COVID was brought for the vaccine. Once you realize that, everything else makes sense. Now, I've seen this comment so many times. What's interesting, it resonates quite a lot. There's 1,500 likes from it. So whether or not you disagree with it, it really resonates with the public. And so I'd say from a public health point of view, that needs to be addressed. You need to answer that question as to what is the connection in terms of the public's view between big finance, big pharma, and the COVID-19. It's not going away. This one here in the UK, they tried to force us into acceptance, but many refused. We were called a vaccine hesitant, but we were actually vaccine adamant. Great video. It's an interesting term, a vaccine adamant. And yes, this is an important point. Many people were under so much pressure, and what we didn't have was the balance of the scientific community looking at, well, if you have areas that have low vaccine penetrance, we should expect that they should be decimated by COVID-19. And if you don't see that, the scientific community should have stopped and thought, well, how do we explain that? That doesn't seem to make sense. And so this was really important science. I mean, they were using some other drugs in this particular country. They are hesitant to every vaccine, so it's not just COVID. But Papua New Guinea is still really a fascinating area of research that should have been done. Here you have a final point: was the term vaccine hesitancy in relation to the COVID jab amuses me, because after doing my research as to what made this so-called experimental and novel vaccine, I wasn't hesitant. I was absolutely against, as what I've read. We were many of us who decided no way. And so this is an important perspective for many people who were described as vaccine hesitant. And some people did the research and just asked a simple question with regards to their own personal risk, their own personal views, and it should never have been discounted. And I still maintain that mandating the vaccine in those cohorts and forcing some people in those cohorts to have it was actually very, very damaging for vaccines generally across the board. And so I think that there is a lot for public health to learn from this. And one hopes that they wouldn't do this again. Always educate, help people to understand why, and then take it from there. So moving on to number 6. So we're counting down. We did number 10, 9, 8. We're now at number 6. And number 6 was this Dr. John Campbell censored. And that is how much longer before the censorship of science ends. So in this video here, this was about, I can't remember what I think it was an interview that he had with a politician that was not liked, and it was perceived as too political, and that video was censored. But the point being is that Dr. John Campbell had been such a balanced perspective throughout his discussions, initially supporting the vaccination thing, but following the science and seeing that there were issues. And for him to have been censored, I thought was a very bad sign. I don't think it has happened again, but for those who have been censored, it does have an impact. I've been censored a number of times, and I still can't understand why, because the videos were really talking about science. They were just inconvenient science, but that's a different story. In terms of what the top comments were here, is that the more they harass him, the greater his credibility. How stupid are they not to see that or care about it? That had 1.5 thousand likes. And as a Brit Australian scientist, this was about Andrew Bridgen. True heroes, the corrupt established will not win this scam. Truly a crime against humanity. Let's get behind these brave gentlemen. And this is where the system can shoot itself in the foot by ignoring, not listening and not observing, because it's not just one person who has commented. There has been quite a number of people who agree with that comment, and it is damaging the narrative or damaging the perception of public health across the world. And the final comment here is Dr. John Campbell is an old school clinical scientist like myself. In the beginning, I took it quite some more to realize the government entities, mass media, science publishers, as well as medical authorities can't be trusted any longer because they are bought or paid for. I can only tell people, and I try and reflect this when I come across people in the scientific medical community, the damage to credibility in some parts of the public is so significant that I think it will take decades to recover. These are really, really damaging perspectives because so many people think that this was not about science and this was about finance. In time, we'll see whether or not they were completely right or only partially right. Let's hope that there is an opportunity for the scientific community to be able to pick up the position and try and make sure that we undo the damage. So moving on, sorry, the last one was number 7. This is actually number 6. This is a very recent video, Geert's warning on the new COVID variant. And so we only did this on the 23rd or the 22nd of December. And this is already number 6. So I expect this to continue to grow. It's a very important video. And it's one where Geert is trying to explain the transition with regards to what he thinks is going to happen next with the COVID variant. I've learned that you need to give Geert the time to share as much as he can because it is so complex. But we've done a number of videos around it to try and break down some of the concepts. And I hope is that I can get Geert again back soon to discuss with someone else to try and break down some of these very complex topics and make sure people are aware, because it's a very serious warning. As I've said to people, I get to talk to Geert before and after. I can tell you that Gert is really, really very worried. This is not him just trying to get attention, as some people think. This is a very serious concern, and he has a real concern for humanity coming through some of the outcomes of this pandemic. It's well worth listening to that video. And as I said, all of the links to them are in the description. Here is some of the top comments from that time. And this one is I have not made many good decisions in my life, but as soon as they started talking about vaccinating the entire world for free, I knew in my heart to not follow the masses. So I was very thankful for that insight, even though it cost me my career in education. I now have my own business and have a way happier in the long run. I pray for those who got caught up in this disaster and wish you well, even though some of them wish me dead for not vaccinating. This is extremely sad. His 1.7 thousand likes. This is really touching because he was willing to sacrifice his career. Luckily for him, he made it through it. But that's the reality for many people. And that's why they almost are in a position where they don't feel they can forgive the establishment for forcing them down that route. And it is, and as I oftentimes say, I try and see if I can get that community that even though they have been hurt by the actions in the pandemic, we all need to find a way to be able to overcome that and look for solutions. And as we say, protect our fellow man. That's the hope that one would do. Because in truth, my view is that if people criticize the other cohorts in the same way they were criticized, they're not any different. And so I think that it's an important opportunity for that cohort to take a different stance and to try and look and protect their fellow man in a way that they were not protected. So it's important point. Second one here, Gert explains everything in a simple way while discussing the common sense of his position. I applaud this gentleman for his quest to get the word out for the sake of science and humanity. Absolutely right. I think that this is so important. It's not always simple, though, but he does try his best to explain it, even with the language difficulties. And then here, the more Gert outlines all the complications and implications of pharmaceutical interference, the more it appears natural herd immunity should have been the obvious response. Important point. The only thing that I would say that's different around that point is that I actually think that if the scientific community had gone down the route of targeted vaccination, where they knew who was at high risk, your simple question was, have you already been exposed? So if the person has already been faced the virus, had the infection, then there is no point. If they're in the high risk cohort, therefore, without having faced the infection, and you targeted your vaccination to those, I think that the outcomes from the pandemic would have been the most successful. And that would have been beneficial to the industry. But I think that too many people got greedy. They got greedy for what they thought was initial success, and they tried to take the whole bone. And they have completely damaged the opportunity, I think, for mRNA technology, because this is what's primarily being used. And they still haven't even acknowledged where they made the mistake. I don't know what is going to be the long term outcome from this, but I can tell you that when you look at how it was approached, that's what I think history will show is that if they had been much more cautious in the way that they had made their moves, they would have been in a much better position now. And most importantly, with only a small percentage of the population being vaccinated, they would have naturally reached herd immunity, especially with the younger cohorts. That's just my opinion, and we'll see what the outcomes are. So, moving on to number 5 for 2023. This is the heart failure epidemic. And this was done earlier in the year. This was actually probably one of my most important clinical videos because I could see what was going to happen. And it was around the fact that over time, we were going to see with infection and also what happens with myocarditis around vaccination, when you put the two together and you have recurrent infection, This is the monster that we have to face. This is coming. And the problem with heart failure is very different from many other issues. Heart failure, we can scratch at the edges with medication, but there are very limited options, and it really does reduce length of life. This is a big one, and we're only starting to see the outcomes of it. That's the sad part. And I don't know what else to say other than from a clinical point of view, this is very, very sad. And we will see what happens in the next 3 to 5 years. Now, these were the top comments. As you can see, this had here almost 300,000 views. And this one here is, I still struggle to understand how millions of people queued up to receive into their circulation an unknown substance, and not once, but twice, 3 or 4 times. This person was in Italy, persecuted, blackmailed, threatened, discriminated, excluded from social activities and travel. And the worse I got, the more I resisted. Recent blood and urine tests show all systems working well. I did get the flu last week and in a few days without any medication. So this is an example. And I don't think that much of the population who went along with the narrative understands how much damage they did to a cohort of their own population who didn't agree with them. I mean, that was frightening to see how many people would have locked people up. They were happy for their children to be taken away. That it's just absolutely frightening that the public would go along with something like that so easily. So that reflects what happened in Italy, where they were really, really draconian with some of the rules. That resonated again. That was 3.7 thousand likes. That's how many people responded to this. 490 replies. Fascinating to read them. So if you want to look at the full comments, click on the links in the description. This one here, I'm a cardiac cath nurse. Our heart failure cases have jumped through the roof. The doctors are saying hush about it. The majority of the staff bring it up, but deny it's related to COVID and the jab. It's driving me crazy. Listen, for those people who understand and who can see what is happening, it is frightening. And as I said, for much of the cohort in the medical community, they have followed the science. The problem is the science wasn't as clear cut as it was demonstrated. Now, once they have locked into that position, it is very difficult for them to shift from it. And I think that that is one of the reasons why I am worried for the medical fraternity. If they don't go back to basics and looking and understanding the science, because the damage to their credibility can be huge. The final point that the person made on this video, somebody else, I've never had a COVID vaccine. I've been sick in a few years. The doctor recommended I take the jab. I told him no. I explained my reasons and my refusal to accept it. A year later, the doctor admitted my justification. I noticed the doctor was not in good shape, and he used to be in good condition a few years ago. And in effect, they're saying that he seems that he has been damaged by the jab. That's possible. That had 500 likes. I don't think that that's easy to demonstrate. I'm not sure if that's necessarily the helpful position to go from. But again, as I have learned, you observe these things, reflect on it, and you see whether or not there is any evidence in clinical work. But again, everything is a learning curve, and we still have a long way to go to try and understand the science. So, again, for those who are with me, yes, stepping down to number 4, we don't have that long to go. COVID vaccine autoimmune explosion. And again, this was done earlier in the year. I was again predicting, as I said, if this is a viral mediated autoimmune disease and you put in the mix an immune response, what are the likely outcomes? And from my observation, from my thinking and research, you're going to see a massive rise in autoimmune disease. This was what was demonstrated in a small study in Italy. This is what is coming out of the evidence population wise in Korea. South Korea. This could have been predicted if there was an understanding of this point about viral mediated autoimmunity. So, this is why I keep on hammering it home. Some people still don't get it. I understand that. But you have to find an explanation as to why we're seeing these patterns that we have never seen before in a pandemic and because of an intervention in a pandemic. So, here were the top comments for that video. And this one is, I'm still stunned at the number of people who voluntarily went for the jabs. The ones who were forced to work for, I have sympathy for. Those who call the rest of us tinfoil hat wearers, plague rats, granny killers, etc., I have no sympathy for. At least still, I understand the perspective, still is harsh. And people genuinely were afraid. And I oftentimes make the reflection that for people who are afraid, when it is a genuine fear, like a fear of heights or fear of small spaces, when people are afraid, they no longer become objective. And I think that that needs to be taken into consideration. It's just that people need to recognize that that would have been the case. And that comment had 2.6 thousand views. So you can see how well it resonates with people. This one here, both my kids were diagnosed with autoimmune diseases 6 months or so after they got the jab. And this was behind their back. Their lives have been so much harder than it would have been now. I am devastated. I think that this is a very sad situation where, certainly in schools, if you had some parents who, for whatever reason, were against that, and that the children were given the choice and forced into it. Because, as I said, the longer term outcomes are still going to be there for those people to deal with. That's going to be another huge one if children are damaged. And based on the autoimmune principle, I can only anticipate that this is going to be the case. Whether or not it can be tied to it, I don't know. But the children were always at really low risks. Not that no one had anything, but I think even statistics coming out of Israel, who had done detailed statistics, we're talking about 3 in a million who were hospitalized. It was just such small numbers. That should have been the question. Why weren't children so affected? But now that actions have been taken, we're in a completely different phase of the pandemic, and we will have to figure it out. And the final point was here, there were doctors who said this would happen almost 3 years ago. They were silenced. Crimes against humanity. That even resonates with me. That had 1.8 thousand views. I do think that if there had been more objective discussions where we could have focused on really, and my view would have been, I would have just raised all of the abnormal patterns around the pandemic to say to the clinical community that, listen, there is something here that is not right. You need to go back to the science to understand what are the mechanisms that lead to severe disease, and then reflect on what interventions you can take to make a difference. And please ask the most obvious question. We have never used steroids in this way in a viral infection pandemic. Why are they working? That's got to be autoimmunity. So it's that kind of question that just wasn't given the opportunity to be put in front of people and for them to reflect on scientifically. So coming now into the top three. In number three position, exposing the hidden COVID injury. And this was all about how important the retina is and being able to do optical coherence tomography, to use that to try and understand what kind of damage could be happening to people. Because many people may be damaged. There are things like microclots, there are autoimmune issues. How is that manifesting itself, and can we see it in the retina? So my instinct is that this is going to be a huge area of research, and the problem is there are still limitations to what it can do or what we understand it can do. But if you add artificial intelligence onto this, using these images that have been there for many years, people having OCT done 5 years ago before the pandemic, and then comparing it to now, I think is going to be really, really important research. Here are the top comments. That video had 400,000 views. And this person says, so sorry for people who took the jab. I left my job after 25 years as a flight attendant. So many people lost their positions because of these mandates. It's all very, very sad. And so this person says, to the people in the comments who got injured, I am so sorry this has happened to you. Please don't be mad at the ones that didn't take it. I love you guys, and I pray you all recover from this tragedy. He says, I didn't get the jab, but I now live outside due to the pandemic. Justice will be served to God's children. That's very kind words and important to reflect on, the fact that many people have been injured, and we still need to delineate what these injuries are. We need to understand fully the mechanisms and then try and come up with ways that it can be mitigated. These are important times, important areas of research, and this is why I said we just have to remain objective and try and focus on how to get solutions, how to identify problems, how to get solutions. Now to number two. We're almost at the end here. So, number two is this tsunami of COVID. I can't say the word, deaths. So, what's interesting about this video is that this video is still limited, meaning that there's certain, it can't be, ads don't come up to it, so to speak, or very rarely, because of what it is implying. And you can see in the background here, this is supposed to be a tsunami coming to wash over this village. This is not a joke. I think it's just knowing how long it takes for this tsunami to hit. But my view is still that this is going to happen. I don't see how, based on autoimmunity, and that's where I'm coming from. From an autoimmune perspective, this has to occur. It's just a matter of when. It could be as a storm surge where the water just keeps rising, or as a big wave. But I am very worried about this. And in terms of what the comments were, so this video had over 700,000 views. And here are some of the top comments. My non-smoker, non-drinker, non-fast food eater husband of 35 years passed away in the ICU from COVID pneumonia. And he had a hernia at the time. Then he was tested positive. He had antibodies. And sadly, the hospital would only allow me and two of our adult sons to say goodbye. So for all the kids and those who are allowed, still heartbroken. He had zero comorbidities. I'm positive the hospital killed him. It's just disgusting and evil. Now, this was one of the reasons why so many people got afraid. He was very healthy and he still got severe COVID-19. And I think that this is such an important point. When you understand the science around why that cytokine storm occurs because of a delayed interferon response. And then you understand that up to 10% of the population have interferon autoantibodies. When you put the two together, I would then suspect that in that case, those were interferon autoantibodies that allowed the virus to get into the lungs without an immune response, which then triggered that severe disease. It's very sad. I think he went into hospital just for something else and then got COVID. And I do wish her and the family condolences. I'm sure it's still hurting even now. The other comment here, my wife of 20 years passed without his knowledge, took the vax. She never ever took vaccines and refused most prescriptions recommended to her. And he says the panic instilled into the public was tremendous and overwhelmed the astute, health oriented people, causing them to lose good sense and act irrationally. And sadly, she passed away a month later. Now, it's difficult to know without going into detail of each individual case. You don't know what her comorbidities were. You don't know what she died from. And so you can't necessarily directly link it. But he's making the point that he couldn't find any other logical reason. And within 28 days, in truth, if she was in a research trial, that would have been considered a significant adverse event, and it would have been included as something to look out for. So that again is very, very sad. But he highlighted the point that so many people were made afraid that it's not surprising that they stepped aside from their instincts. As I said, fear is a very, very powerful emotion. And the final point on this one here: refused to get the job, convinced my father not to get it, was probably the best thing I've ever done. I wish I could have convinced my entire family. One member of the family regrets it, and they are afraid every day they might drop dead. It is heartbreaking. I, again, I like balance, and I don't think that the point is not that everybody is going to have a problem. It doesn't work like that in medicine. It's usually a very small percentage, but it is significant at a population level. And it's what is sad is that people who may have already had natural immunity or were at extremely low risk, if that cohort then has complications, that is extremely sad. But we have to still remember that the high risk cohort still benefited from the protection of severe COVID 19. As I've said all along, if they had just targeted it and allowed herd immunity and then used early treatment if somebody got sick, I think that we could have seen a fraction. When I say a fraction, I am meaning instead of 6.5 million deaths, you're talking about a few thousand deaths where people slip through the net. This did not need to happen in this way if we were allowed to look objectively at the science. Important points for us to reflect on for the future. And the number one, so that was number two, number one video. And in a sense, I am glad it's number one because I think it is that important. Is this unbelievable? First full autopsy, COVID vaccinated death. It was and still is unbelievable that we had to wait until 2023 for someone to publish an autopsy on somebody fully vaccinated who died of COVID. I mean, and you know what's sad? We still don't have autopsies. We're still scratching at the edge. And listen, it can be done, as you can see when they published the Matthew Perry autopsy just recently. They put it out because they wanted to probably make sure that people saw it wasn't connected to anything else. So autopsies can be done and they can be published and we can analyze it. For whatever reason, this is not being done. I cannot express that we are flying blind without this kind of information. It is critical, absolutely critical to be assessed and to be understood. Really important. Without this, without these autopsies, the reality is that we are unlikely to find solutions quickly. I hope that changes. But so far, to the end of 2023, this hasn't changed that much. And that video had almost 800,000 views. And I hope that this has jolted the medical, this is more about the pathology community, to do as much research as they can. And please share it so that we can understand. Here is one of my, I had to laugh when I saw this. This comment was, I had a friend ask me, how did you know not to take it? And the response was, my question for everyone is took it is, how did you not know? I begged people not to do it and was ruthlessly mocked. This had 3.2 thousand likes. I do think I laughed, but I don't think it was that simple. And yes, for those who were doing some research, now you have to remember that not everybody who was unvaccinated were necessarily doing research. Some people, I don't know why they weren't listening. Maybe they just didn't trust anything at all from public health. I don't know what the reasons were, but clearly that person was researching and trying to emphasize to other people, do some research, look at it. But again, it's all about risk benefit. I would have said high risk cohorts, yes, absolutely, do the risk benefit analysis And if you are at high risk and haven't been infected, then it would certainly still potentially have made sense. So this one here, I am a nurse. I was forced to quit my job because I refused to get the shot. I was not nor will ever receive it. I refuse to be a guinea pig for big pharma and the healthcare cabal. God has kept me safe. I worked as an ER nurse through the worst of the pandemic. I'm glad I used common sense. Now, this is an example of where, if she was in emergency room in the COVID-19 pandemic, absolutely she would have faced the virus. So she would have had natural immunity. This is why she didn't get severe COVID-19. So that was completely illogical for that to be mandated to somebody who already had natural immunity. We never do that in medicine. So that's where I think, I wouldn't say it's unforgivable, but it's scientifically so flawed that when history looks back at it, it is going to be shocking for us to face that. How can you have somebody facing the virus, trying to save lives, and then make them lose their job because you don't accept they have immunity? Really, really makes no sense. And the final comment here, I was weak and got vaccinated. It has definitely affected my heart and breathing. I can no longer go running. I so respect all those people who did not and took real courage to stand up to all that abuse and vilification. And that is sad and at the same time touching that someone was pressured because of whatever reason. It may have been work, it may have been travel, and critically, that they then had adverse events. And you know what's worse? The medical community oftentimes doesn't acknowledge that it could have been an adverse event. So this person is now struggling with long term health issues. They are now rejected both by both communities. And they were, in their mind, trying to potentially do the right thing. But they did end with the final point, which is that those people who lost jobs, lost family for that belief in what they were doing were actually quite strong. It was something to behold. And I think the world, again, when it looks back at this time, at this point in history, will reflect that truth with regards to that cohort of people. So, yes, that is my top 10 videos for 2023. I'm very appreciative for everybody who's been with me, and I look forward to 2024. We've had two areas of censorship in 2023, which certainly affected viewership. I'm hoping that I can avoid that in 2024 and continue to build on the content that has been done. So, for the new year, I wish you all a wonderful season. I hope that some of my predictions and some of Geert's predictions are likely to be wrong, and I would happily be the butt of jokes in the future if it turns out that there are no problems going into the next 3 to 5 years. But the truth is that I expect this to be a rough ride. And I think that we are going to have to, as a whole community, start looking for solutions to make sure that we protect and mitigate as much damage as we can. Have a happy, wonderful, and blessed New Year. Thank you very much.